Hey there, I'm Sean Finnegan, and you are listening to Restitutio, a podcast that seeks to recover authentic Christianity and live it out today. Paul wrote extensively about worldly wisdom in 1 Corinthians. Due to the prevalence and esteem of philosophical schools, he probably felt a need to explain how Christianity measured up. In this lecture, we'll survey the 5 main philosophical options available to first century Christians, including Platonism, Cynicism, Skepticism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism. Then, once we've got a cursory grasp of how each of these approaches worked, we'll contrast them to Paul's idea of spiritually discerned truths, which are available only to the mature in Christ, which he lays out in the first 3 chapters of 1 Corinthians. I think this is one of those episodes that's really going to make the Bible come alive for you once you're able to read 1 Corinthians over against the background of its own time. So hopefully this will pop for you. Here now is episode 587, part 4 of our 1 Corinthians in Context class, Philosophy and Wisdom. Typical people in Corinth would probably not have thought of Christianity as a religion. For us, that sounds weird. Christianity today is the biggest religion in the world. When people talk about religions, they usually talk about it in comparison to Christianity. But in the Roman world, religion was kind of different than what we talk about today. Religion was about pietas, which is where we get the word piety from, and it's the idea of duty. And you have a duty collectively as a society, or in the case of Corinth, as a city, to the gods. They had a phrase, do ut des, I give that you might give. And the idea was simple. You take care of the gods take care of you. Faith wasn't a category. Faith wasn't part of, I know it sounds like a really weird thing to say, but like nobody cared if you believed in the gods. Everybody believed in the gods. Like it wasn't significant. And how you lived wasn't really the concern of religion either. It was just taking care of, let me show you what I mean. So you had augurs. Augurs are professionals that observed the movements of animals, especially birds, to decipher omens and inform important people on making decisions. So if there would be a battle, they would have an augur come and they would observe how the birds were flying, and they would say, oh, we should delay. Let's wait till tomorrow. And so that was one way they exercised their religion. Another was haruspaces, which is where you cut open animals like sheep, goats, cattle, or pigs, and you examine their internal organs to decipher a message from the gods, especially the liver. They want to look at the liver, they want to see what shape it is, what color it is, and they would tell the inquirer the gods are not happy or the gods are happy, and this sort of thing. They had trained priests called sacrificuli, and they had assistants called victimari, and they would slaughter animals at altars and offer them to the gods. Then there were pontifices, which were priests of different types. They offered animal sacrifices, they had temples, and they had statues. This is religion in Corinth. Christianity doesn't do any of these things. Christianity doesn't observe the flight of birds. Christianity doesn't care what the liver looks like in an animal. Christians don't have priests, at least not at this stage. Christians didn't have animal sacrifices. We had no temples. At least the Jews had a temple back in Jerusalem. Christians had no temples. What? And there were no statues. You call yourself a religion? So, what do Christians do? We emphasize beliefs and behavior. Beliefs and behavior. We ate together, we gathered to hear authoritative texts read out loud. Guess what? That's what everyone would associate with a philosophical school. If you were a sect of philosophy, you did those things. You worried about what to believe, how to behave, you ate together, and you heard authoritative texts read out loud, like the works of Plato, for example. So, philosophers focus on wisdom. If you didn't know, philosophy is a compound word of the word love and the word wisdom. So it means the love of wisdom. Corinthian Christians may have even presented themselves as a school of philosophy early on. When it comes to the subject of wisdom, Paul does a lot with it in 1 Corinthians, especially in the first 4 chapters. Paul Gardner writes, "The main underlying issue that Paul addresses concerns the possession of wisdom and knowledge. The Corinthians regarded these as spiritual gifts and gave them a significance and importance that caused spiritual arrogance among some." These people were definitely spiritually arrogant, okay? And that's one of the things Paul is addressing over and over again. We read in 1 Corinthians 1:17, it says, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power. For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scholar? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of the proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews ask for signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." Once again, Paul delights in how God set it all up. He knows the story about a crucified hero is utter nonsense in a city like Corinth, where you have all these different ideas competing with each other. Only if it had been so simple could God reach so many with salvation. If it was so great, the wisdom of this world, if it was so great, then the philosophers would have discovered God. The philosophers would have discovered salvation, but they didn't. So the wisdom of this world is defective. There's something wrong with it. It's not like he says, wisdom is stupid, who cares about it? That's not what he's saying. It's more sophisticated than that. We'll come back to this in a minute. But for now, let's try to familiarize ourselves with the philosophical schools that were in the city of Corinth in the first century. Now, philosophy was a big deal. By Paul's time, philosophy was already 6 centuries old. Like the earliest Greek philosophers before Socrates were 6 centuries before Christ. So, and then in the 3rd century, the 4th and 3rd century, there was a huge renaissance, not really renaissance, but explosion of Greek philosophical schools in Athens, but also in other places throughout Greece. So we get philosophers like Plato, Diogenes, Pyrrho, Epicurus, and Zeno. Philosophy sought to answer the question, how do I lead the good life? That's what they wanted to know. The practical guide to achieving this was to pursue eudaimonia. That's a Greek word. And the Latin word is felicitas. We have the word felicity from it, right? So this is the idea of flourishing or happiness, but like in a deeper sense. You know, like you want to have a good life. You want to have tranquility. You want to be able to handle whatever life throws at you. The philosophers were trying to figure that out. Now, I can't cover all the philosophers. I'm not going to hit Socrates or Aristotle. I don't know if you noticed, they're both missing from my chart. But I'm focusing on the ones that were ascendant at the time that Paul was there in Corinth and that Paul is writing to the Corinthians. Okay? Aristotle will have his heyday 1,000 years later. Plato even wasn't that big of a deal in the first century. It wasn't really till the 3rd century that Neoplatonism really got going. So I'm just going to focus on the ones that were there at that time. First up, we're going to look at Platonism, but we also are going to look at Cynicism, Skepticism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism. And I'm going to be as brief as I can, which is very hard for me, but I'm going to try, because I just want you to have like a snapshot, just a brief understanding of each of these 5 schools of thought, because these are the competitors for Christianity in Corinth. It's not worshiping Apollo. People are still going to be worshiping Apollo whether they like it or not. You know what I mean? Like that was something different. But you would be arguing with a Stoic philosopher, or you'd be arguing with an Epicurean, or you see a Cynic, you'd be like, yo, what is that guy doing? Let's go talk to him. Let's tell him about Jesus, right? These are the kinds of conversations that were happening. All right, so Platonism is first. Plato writes about Socrates. Socrates doesn't write anything. Plato writes about Socrates, and we don't know too much about Plato himself, but we do know that many of his books have survived, and that he talked about another realm of the forms, a realm of unchangeable entities that were perfect. And our world is a copy. We live in a shadow world of this other higher world where the real things are. And our goal is to pursue virtue so that we can lead the good life. We want to be as close to those perfected forms of reality as we can be. And of course, at the top of all the forms is the good with a capital G, or the one, which is identified typically as like the supreme God over all. Our souls are able to ascend through contemplation of philosophical truths to the higher realm, and that is something that Plato talks about a lot. Detachment from the physical world, pursuing virtues, cultivating virtues. Pursuing virtues is the way to happiness and having a good life. I could say a lot more about Plato, but in all honesty, Platonism wasn't that big in Corinth in the 1st century, so I'm just going to leave it there. We're going to move on to the next one, okay? Cynicism. The founder of Cynicism was a guy named Diogenes of Sinope. He lived from 412 to 323 BC. He believed in a life of simplicity. One day he was watching a mouse run around, and he noticed that the mouse was a minimalist, and the mouse didn't carry things with it, and it didn't worry about the things that people worry about. And he said, there's the wisdom of the mouse. I must learn from this mouse, and I will simplify my life. And so he didn't seek shelter anymore. From then on, Diogenes lived outside. He didn't search for what people searched for, and he doubled his cloak so that it would work as a garment, but also to sleep in. He carried a knapsack with him for food and embraced homelessness. He was an ultra minimalist. He only had 1 cup. He had 1 cup, and one day he was at the fountain getting water, and he saw a child using his hands to drink. And he threw away his cup, and he said, I have been outdone by a child. Threw away his cup, never used it again. The child has outdone me. He believed in training himself physically and mentally. Diogenes would roll around in the hot sand in the summer. He would hug snow-covered statues in the winter. He tried to eat raw meat, but he couldn't digest it. He would stay outside in the rain. He once begged alms of a statue. That's how he got money. He begged. And he was one day they saw him begging of a statue. And they said, Diogenes, why are you begging money from a statue? To which he replied, to get practice in being turned down. He trained his body and his mind both to be strong, and he wanted to act according to nature as revealed by his body. So if he was hungry, he ate. It didn't matter what time it was or what other people thought. If he was tired, he slept. It didn't matter what everybody else was doing. If he was tired, he slept. He had no concern for tradition, custom, or etiquette. When reproved for eating in the marketplace, he said, it was in the marketplace I got hungry. So this is basically the guy in the grocery store you see pop open a bag of chips and start eating while he's shopping in the store. All right, that's Diogenes. He had lots of interactions with Plato. I'm not really going to go into it, but they criticized each other a lot. He didn't really like Plato. Plato didn't really like Diogenes. Diogenes made fun of Plato's long-windedness. Plato criticized Diogenes' vanity and his concern for his reputation. And Plato named Diogenes the dog. And so he kind of was a dog because he lived outside and he just like went for scraps. He owned it. He embraced that identification. When Plato was applauded for defining a man as an animal with 2 legs and no feathers, Diogenes tore the feathers out of a rooster, brought it before the class, and said, "Behold, Plato's man." He had interactions with Alexander the Great. One time when Diogenes was sunbathing in Corinth, Alexander the Great came up to him and said, "Ask whatever you desire." To which Diogenes replied, "Stand out of my light." Once Alexander said to him, "I am Alexander the great king." To which Diogenes replied, "And I am Diogenes the dog." Another time Alexander came to him and said, "Don't you fear me?" And Diogenes said, "What do you mean? Are you good or evil?" Alexander said, "I am good." Diogenes says, "Why would I fear what is good?" He was provocative. One time when watching a bad archer, he sat next to the target and said, "So I won't be hit." When asked what wine he enjoyed, he replied, "Somebody else's." When asked by tourists where Demosthenes was, he pointed him out with his middle finger. And the middle finger meant, what it means for us, more or less. When someone hit him with a beam and said, "Look out," Diogenes hit him with a staff and said, "Look out yourself." These are just the funniest stories. I could go on and on. We're going to have to skip ahead. All right, he was loved by the Athenians, the people in Athens, but he was also laughed at a lot. Jerome Murphy O'Connor says, "The fundamental principle of Diogenes' philosophy was that happiness could be achieved only by satisfying one's natural needs in the easiest and cheapest way. Since this inevitably involved a certain shamelessness, he was known as the dog, Cyne, and followers as cynics." Here's a little story about him told by a different Diogenes, Diogenes Laertius. He talks about Diogenes of Sinope. He says, "And he endured being sold into slavery with great dignity. On a voyage to Aegina, he was captured by pirates under Scerpalus' command, transported to Crete, and put up for sale." Can you imagine that, getting your ship taken over by pirates and being sold into slavery? How devastating would that be to a normal person? Diogenes is just totally fine. And when the herald asked Diogenes, what he was good at, he replied, "Ruling over men." Pointing to an affluent Corinthian, the above-mentioned Xeniades, he said, "Sell me to him. He needs a master." Thus Xeniades purchased him, took him home to Corinth, put him in charge of his own sons, and entrusted him with his entire household. And Diogenes performed all his duties in such a manner that Xeniades went about saying, "A kindly deity has entered my house." Diogenes' friends wanted to ransom him, for which he called them imbeciles. For he maintained that lions are not the slaves of those who feed them. It is the feeders, rather, who are the lions' slaves. For fear is the mark of a slave, and wild beasts make men fearful. Diogenes possessed astonishing powers of persuasion, and hence could easily sway anyone he liked with his arguments. So, as this story tells us, Diogenes, who was from Athens, who was a conversation partner for Plato, who was a very provocative person, ended up in Corinth. He lived until the age of 90. He died in Corinth. He was buried by the gate going out towards the Isthmus of Corinth. And there was a memorial of Diogenes there in Corinth. Even 450 years later, when Pausanias gets there, which is like about a century after Paul, he talks about how there are memorials to Diogenes as he goes into Corinth. So he was a big deal, had a big influence in Corinth. On to Skepticism. The founder of Skepticism was a man named Pyrrho of Elis, who lived from 360 to 270 BC. We learn about him that Pyrrho introduced the notion of inability to attain conviction and that of suspension of judgment. For he said that nothing is beautiful or ugly, or just or unjust, and that likewise in all instances nothing exists in truth, but men do everything by custom and by habit. On a voyage at sea, a storm arose, and Pyrrho was on the ship, and he looked over and there was a pig, and it was just eating his food, totally unconcerned about the storm. And Pyrrho says, that's how I want to be. I want to be like that pig. That pig could go through a storm and have peace. And that was the idea of pursuing tranquility over certainty. Pyrrho thinks that it's all these dogmatic philosophers that are so certain of all these truths that they are proclaiming. That's really the cause of anxiety. We just need to recognize that we don't know and just embrace the doubt and move on with life. That was Pyrrho's approach. For every argument, he said, there's an equally good counter-argument. You can't know anything with certainty. Our senses are deceivable. Our cognitive faculties are deceivable. So embrace doubt. Just live according to customs and pursue the practical necessities. This is like exactly the opposite of Diogenes. Diogenes is like, give me your custom. We just destroy your customs, right? Whereas Pyrrho's like, yeah, who knows? Let's just follow the rules like they're supposed to be. About him, Diogenes Laertius writes, to them the skeptics reply, we acknowledge our human feelings, for we recognize that it is day, that we are alive, and many other things that appear in life. But with regard to the things the dogmatic philosophers affirm so positively in argument, claiming to have comprehended them, we suspend judgment on the grounds that they are not certain, and we know only what we feel. We admit that we see, we recognize that we think this or that, but how we see or how we think, we do not know. And in ordinary conversation, we say that a certain thing appears white, but without affirming strongly that it actually is white. So that's the skeptics. Next to the Epicureans and Epicureanism. Founded by Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BC. Epicurus gets a bad reputation. Everybody thinks Epicurus was just a hedonist who taught pursuing short-term pleasure regardless of the consequences. Totally not the case. He was a sophisticated philosopher. As late as the 3rd century, so 2 centuries after Paul went to Corinth, we have reports of Epicurean schools, well-ordered, with established leaders, still carrying on. So it was a significant force in the ancient world. He believed that the gods existed. Sometimes people say Epicureans were atheists. They were not, or at least Epicurus wasn't. There might have been some Epicurean atheists, but Epicurus himself believed the gods existed, but he didn't think that they cared about humans. He said there are 2 great fears, fear of the gods and fear of death. And he said, look, the gods want to pursue pleasure and avoid pain just like us. So there's no way that they're worried about how we're doing. Our world is a mess. There's so much suffering here. There's no way the gods care about us. So you don't need to worry about the gods. And then with death, he said, look, dead people don't exist. And so long as you're alive, death doesn't exist. So don't worry about death. And he said, you don't need to worry about the gods. You don't need to worry about death. You just pursue what is good for you. Here are some of the teachings of the Epicureans, according to Diogenes Laertius. Even when he is tortured, the wise man is content. The wise man will not consort with women in any manner prescribed by law, nor will he punish his servants. The Epicureans do not think that the wise man will fall in love, nor will he be concerned about his burial, nor do they think that love is sent by the gods, nor will the wise man make fine speeches. They maintain that sexual relations are never beneficial, and that one should be grateful not to be injured by them. The wise man will not marry and beget children. He will not talk nonsense when drunk. He will not participate in politics, or make himself a tyrant, or live like a cynic, or be a beggar. The wise man will also experience grief. He will avail himself of the law courts. He will take thought for his property, and for the future, he will love the countryside. So just a flavor of the Epicurean philosophy. Not nearly as hedonistic as you would have thought. Like he's like, nobody should even have sex at all. Like if you could avoid it, don't get married, don't have any kids. So this is a little different than probably you're thinking. Here's another statement from Epicurus himself in his letter to Menicius. He says, pleasure is the beginning and the end of a happy life. And it is because pleasure is our first and innate good that we choose every pleasure, though we often forgo many pleasures when a greater annoyance results from them. And we regard many pains as preferable to pleasures when a prolonged endurance of pains brings us greater pleasure. For simple fare brings as much pleasure as an extravagant feast, once the pain of want has been removed. And barley cake and water give a hungry man the greatest pleasure. To accustom oneself, therefore, to simple, inexpensive fare supplies the essentials of health and enables a man to face the demands of life without shrinking and puts us in a better condition when we encounter expensive fare from time to time and makes us fearless of fortune. But when we say that pleasure is our goal, we do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or the self-indulgent, as the ignorant think, or those who disagree with or misinterpret our views. By pleasures, we mean the absence of pain in the body and of torment in the soul. For it is not drinking bouts and continuous carousals, nor the pleasures to be had with boys and women, nor the enjoyment of fish and all other delicacies a luxurious table furnishes that produce a pleasant life, but the sober reasoning that examines the basis of every choice and aversion and banishes the beliefs that afflict the soul with its worst torments. Man, could write, huh? Epicurus said, if you adopt this way of life, you will live like a god among men. On to Stoicism. Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium, who lived from 334 to 262 BC. He was initially trained under the Cynic teacher Crates, but he couldn't embrace the shamelessness of the Cynics. Zeno's like, I see your point, but I don't know about just doing the stuff you guys did. I mean, I didn't tell you any of the X-rated stuff about Diogenes, but you can look it up yourself if you really want to know. Zeno is like, okay, I see your point, but I'm not going that far. I'm going to go in this direction, and he starts his own school. And so Zeno gave lectures walking up and down painted stoa, or columns, which is why his followers were known as the Stoics, the people of the columns, because that's where they hung out and had their lessons. Zeno himself, says Diogenes, was sullen and curt and of a shriveled countenance. Not the nicest way to start. He was extremely frugal, his thrift cloaking a barbarous stinginess. If he rebuked anyone, he did so tersely, without elaborating and keeping his distance. His powers of endurance and the austerity of his way of life were unequaled. The food he ate was uncooked, and the cloak he wore was thin. These are compliments, by the way, at least towards the end there. The goal is to live in harmony with nature. That's what Zeno said. What are the virtues? Wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. That's what the Stoic is looking for. They want to cultivate these virtues in their life. Wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. All good things, I think everyone would agree. And then, of course, the vices are the opposite of those. And each person has a duty. You have a duty to yourself to cultivate these virtues. You have a duty to your family. You have a duty to your city. He also taught asceticism, which is the idea of denying pleasure. So this guy is literally the opposite of Epicurus. Epicurus is saying, look, we all want pleasure, which is the absence of pain. So let's just find ways to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Zeno's like, pleasure is actually bad for you. Let's pursue discipline. Pleasure is an irrational elation at obtaining what seems to be desirable. Here's a little teaching summary about the wise man according to Zeno. The wise man is free of passion. The wise man is free of vanity, for he is equally indifferent to good and bad reputation. The good aim genuinely and vigilantly for their own improvement. They are unpretentious. They are not overly busy. They will drink in moderation, but will never get drunk, nor will they go crazy. The wise man will not be afflicted by grief, since grief is an irrational contraction of the soul. The good are also God-fearing, for they are conversant with customs that concern the gods, and piety is knowledge of how to serve the gods. Moreover, they will sacrifice to the gods, and they keep themselves pure by avoiding offenses against the gods. The wise man will take part in politics, if nothing prevents him, and he will marry and beget children, and he will live like a cynic. It's almost exactly the opposite of what Epicurus said. And he will live like a cynic, since the cynic way of life is a shortcut to virtue. The good man will not live in solitude, for he is suited by nature for society and for action. He will also submit to training for the sake of physical endurance. The wise man does everything well. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. The Stoics also had a strong belief in fate. So whatever happens was meant to happen, and your job is to accept it, regardless what it was. So self-control, stiff upper lip, self-made man, that is Stoicism. So we have these 5 philosophical schools. They were all in Corinth at the same time as Christianity. And Christianity is competing with these guys for members, for adherents, for people to join their meetings. How are you going to do it? These guys are 3 centuries old by the time Paul, this Jewish rabbi, he's a Pharisee. Nobody even knows what that is in Corinth, except for the Jewish synagogue. The Jews, they know what a Pharisee is, but he's got nothing. How is he going to deal with this urbane, sophisticated people and convince them that this little tiny movement is the true way to lead the good life? How's he going to do it? How can Paul convince these people that the way of Christ is the good life? Let's see. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Paul says, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the testimony of God to you with superior speech or wisdom." He just opts out from the first sentence. He's like, look, I ain't a philosopher. I didn't come with superior speech or with wisdom. Verse 2, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I came to you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were made not with persuasive words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God." Paul claims weakness and lack of sophistication up front. He didn't engage philosophically. I mean, you hear these different philosophical schools. You hear the skeptics, you're like, you know what? There's a lot of intellectual humility there. I think the skeptics are right. And then you hear Epicurus, you're like, you know what? He's got a lot of great points too. And then you hear Zeno, and he's saying the exact opposite. And then there's brother Diogenes over here, and he's homeless, and he's saying to everyone, you're all suckers. Why are you in the rat race? I'm the only one that's truly free. And of course, he's a slave of some Corinthian, right? Like, how do you know? How do you know who's right? Paul says they're all wrong. He doesn't say philosophy's dumb and you shouldn't care. But what he says is that this is something different. This is something new. It's not just another slice of the same apple. Instead, he brought an absurd message about a crucified hero. And he knew it was absurd, and he boasted in it being absurd. But he also talks about this new category: spirit and power. We'll come back to that. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 6. "Yet among the mature we do speak wisdom," Sophia. Every time you hear the word wisdom, you should think half of the word philosophy. Okay? Because Sophia is half of the word philosophy. "Yet among the mature we do speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age." Interesting. It's not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are being destroyed, but we speak God's wisdom, a hidden mystery which God decreed before the ages for our glory, and which none of the rulers of this age understood, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So, he says to them earlier, I didn't come with wisdom, but then here he says, Well, there actually is a wisdom among the mature. We do speak wisdom, right? There is a wisdom. Okay, tell us about the wisdom. It's an exclusive wisdom. Most people can't understand it. That's what he's saying. He's saying only the mature can understand it. And even the rulers of this age, they missed it. They didn't understand the wisdom. It's God's hidden mystery. Only the mature get it. And now he's going to segue to talk about the Spirit. Verse 9. But as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor human heart conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him. That's a quote from the Old Testament. These things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For what human knows what is truly human except the human spirit that is within? So also no one comprehends what is truly God's except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit that is from God, so that we may understand the gifts bestowed on us by God, and we speak of these things in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual things to those who are spiritual. Those who are unspiritual do not receive the gifts of God's Spirit, for they are foolishness to them, and they are unable to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. Those who are spiritual discern all things, and they are themselves subject to no one else's scrutiny. He just took a lever and just knocked over all the philosophical schools in one paragraph and said, we got something better. It's better. He's undermined Plato, Diogenes, Pyrrho, Epicurus, and Zeno all at once. Forget the Platonists, forget the Cynics, forget the Skeptics, forget the Stoics, forget the Epicureans. They missed it. There's a deeper truth beyond worldly wisdom. It's not taught by human philosophy, but divine wisdom through the Spirit. Verse 14 again. Those who are unspiritual do not receive the gift of God's Spirit, for they are foolishness to them, and they are unable to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. So if the Corinthian Christians are on a different plane, a spiritual plane, they should expect that the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Cynics, and so forth wouldn't understand what they're talking about. It gives them a kind of a pride, I think in a positive sense, knowing that they're insignificant, but that God's Spirit can empower them to have the truth that these really significant people all missed, which I think is really powerful and empowering. So, Paul drives home his point. If you guys have received God's Spirit and have something better than all the philosophers, stop fighting with each other. That's where he goes. Chapter 3, verse 1. And so, brothers and sisters, I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh. That's a slap to the face right there. I couldn't speak to you as spiritual people, only people of the flesh. Rather, people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for solid food, and even now you are still not ready. Another slap to the face. For you are still of the flesh. For as long as there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving according to human inclinations? For when one says, I belong to Paul, and another, I belong to Apollos, are you not merely human? You guys need to get along. Stop fighting with each other. Get on the spiritual plane. Do you see how effective the Apostle Paul was in his writing? You know, if you want a case, if you want an argument for the inspiration of God in the New Testament, here it is. Like, he's navigating an impossibly complex situation, and he finds like this one category that can make sense of everything, this idea of spirit and being spiritual. And then he says to them, you know, and by this point in the letter, they're just like, yeah, that sounds really good. I'm on board. I want spirit. Let's do this. Yeah, let's do that. That's awesome. And then he turns to them and says, but not you guys. No, you're fighting with each other. You're not spiritual. So effective, it's just such a powerful way of dealing with this. They yearned for significance, and Paul showed them how the gospel was superior to everything else. and that pursuing unity was necessary for those who would be mature. Okay, enough of philosophy and divisions. What I recommend you do is read 1 Corinthians 1 through 4. Just on your own, read it. And here's my hope, my prayer for you, is that a lot of these things we've talked about with status and wealth and Corinthian bronze and philosophies and all this stuff will be able to inform you as you read this on your own, where you're like, oh my goodness, that's what he's talking about. And it'll hopefully make it come alive for you. And then I want you to ask yourself the question, what about me? What about me now in the 21st century? How should I think about status? How should I think about wealth? How should I think about knowledge or philosophy or education? These are all important questions for us to ask ourselves as well. And spirit. We're going to talk tons about spirit because it's an important concept in 1 Corinthians. All right, so next time we're going to leave this whole section of 1 Corinthians behind, jump into chapter 5 and 6, which deals with sexual immorality. And so I hope you'll join me in our next session together and see how Christians dealt with sexual issues 2,000 years ago. Because believe it or not, I think how they dealt with it is really helpful for us today, because as crazy as our world seems to us, their world was even crazier. and I look forward to showing you how that's the case, and also then asking the question, how can we stand faithful to the ethics that we have received in our time? So that's what we'll do next as we continue through this class on 1 Corinthians.
Well, that brings this session to a close. What did you think? Come on over to restitutio.org and find episode 587 and leave your questions and thoughts and feedback there. Now, at the close of my last episode, I read out a negative review for my book, Kingdom Journey, that somebody had posted on Amazon. And to that, Manuel wrote in saying, "Hey, Sean, I want to say your remarks about the rant really hit home to me. It made me really think about the strength in our agreement in what we do believe. I'm really sorry that person gave you a bad rating. We do have differences, but we need our strength in what we believe together to get the message of the kingdom out there. Thanks for speaking about this." Well, thanks for writing in, Manuel, and for the words of encouragement. It certainly was an ironic time for this person to write in such a negative review on my book, even though this person agreed with me literally on everything, apparently, except for how much importance I assigned to one's understanding of the millennium. So, they're basically just like a priority issue. This person wanted me to be equally dogmatic on something that's actually called gospel and something that is really secondary, and where honest-hearted Christians have lots of disagreements. And, I think it's pretty clear, but I'm willing to have fellowship with amillennialists and postmillennialists and really just focus on what Jesus focused on, which is that the ultimate kingdom is certainly coming and that is part of this gospel message that we're called to proclaim. Anyhow, as it turns out, I was reading that out last week on our episode about factions and divisions within the church, and this spirit is still sadly very much alive of factionalism and divisiveness. And that's something that I hope you heard at the end of this present episode is something that Paul's fighting against. This idea that you have all these philosophical sects and they're all saying, oh, no, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that, and they're all forming their own schools and they're all in competition with each other. Of course, not all competition is bad, but within Christianity, we want to be charitable. We want to err on the side of unity as much as we can, even with people that we disagree with on doctrine or on practice, so long as you're not compromising who you are and what you believe and how you live. If you can be in fellowship with a Christian who has different beliefs, I say you do it. Why not? How else are you going to convince that person that your way of seeing it is better if you don't have any contact, if you don't have any conversation and connection? Also, we have to recognize And Gavin Ortlund wrote a book about this not too long ago. Was it Finding the Right Hills to Die On? We have to realize that not every doctrine is equally important. There are some doctrines that are salvational. You get it wrong, you're not saved. That's the most critical information there is. That's what we call gospel. And then you have other doctrines that need to be in agreement in order to have fellowship with other Christians in a worship setting, right? So like maybe you could go eat lunch with them out at a diner or attend a conference with that person, so long as the conference was clearly not going to take sides or violate anyone's sense of what should be done and not done, obviously. But if you want to actually have Sunday fellowship, for example, with somebody, then you do need to have a certain amount of common agreement, or else you just run into chaos in the meeting itself. And then there's an even narrower door for those in church leadership. Those in church leadership really do need to be in agreement on a high percentage of the church's core and secondary beliefs, and sometimes even tertiary beliefs. And each church has to work that out for themselves as to how strict they want to make that door to eldership in particular. And this is totally understandable because the elders are going to be the ones empowered to handle church discipline and teach others, especially in discipleship contexts, what the church believes and answer the questions that people raise. So that's a couple more thoughts on doctrine, the importance of doctrine. Obviously, I'm a big fan of doctrine. I like to think about doctrine a lot, and I don't like to divorce it from practical Christian living. I think both are equally important. You can do the right thing for the wrong reason, and you can do the wrong thing for the right reason. And I want to do the right thing for the right reason. What about you? So I hope God will be gracious enough to help us see areas in which we are incorrect, whether in our practice or our belief, as we continue to pursue truth wherever it leads. Well, that's going to be it for today. Next week, we are having an episode on sexual immorality, tackling 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Definitely an episode where I would discourage you from having your kids listen to if they're not of the age to hear about deviant sexual practices from the ancient world, which I would say is pretty much just most kids. Anyhow, that's up to parents to decide, but it's going to be an interesting episode. I can promise you that, and we'll turn to that next week as we continue in this class. Oh, and one last thing I wanted to mention is that the UCA today has come out with the call for papers for the London conference in England, which will be held July 24th to 27th. So if you are somebody, especially if you are a British somebody or a European somebody, and you would like to present at the Unitarian Christian Alliance conference coming up this July, please submit your paper by May 15th to the email address ukconference@unitarianchristianalliance.org. You can get all that info at unitarianchristianalliance.org, the website, so you can see the requirements there. I think it's 6,000 words, not counting footnotes. And if your paper is selected by the blind review committee, then you will be invited to speak, which would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? So I'm planning to be there this time around. I'm looking forward to going back to England. I have been to England once before. That was a long time ago now. Let's see. Probably in the 90s. So yeah, long enough ago that it will basically be an all new experience for me. And I can't wait to meet folks that are there. I heard Andrew Perryman presented last year, and I'm a super big fan of his book, In the Form of a God. Just have been leaning on it a little bit for this 1 Corinthians class, in fact. So hopefully I can meet him. If not, I look forward to meeting the other brothers and sisters that are there at the event. And if you're interested in coming, whether you're planning on presenting a paper or you just want to do a trip, hey, why not do it? So I hope to see you there. That's July 24 to 27 this summer, coming up 5 months from now. And we'll see you there. If you'd like to support Restitutio, you can do that online at our website, which you can access on your phone or on your PC, or even if you have a Mac, I guess you can still do it. That's restitutio.org. It's like the word restitution with no N. You could come on there, and we do have a donate button, and we certainly appreciate those who are helping us out financially. Also, probably an even bigger way you can support us is just by sharing this episode or other episodes. By sharing it with your friends, either sending them an email to a link. I have this episode on YouTube as video. I have it on YouTube as audio. I have it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much any other podcast app that's out there. In fact, if you know of an app or use something that Restitutio is not on, please let me know so we can get on there and fix that. But yeah, please share it if this did encourage you or bless you, or you think that others might find it interesting. I'll catch you next week, and remember, the truth has nothing to fear.